piano.
Oh, I forgot that part of the story.
Okay.
I wonder when it was. After Dad got the job in northern Manitoba, after he'd left Vancouver, after George had left Vancouver in the end of June of 1958, he was going to go back to Quebec and find a job. And he stopped in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and he got a job at Manitoba Hydro, but it was up on the mile 256 of the Hudson Bay Railway. And it came with a mobile trailer home because he was hired on as management. There were about 12 houses and say maybe 14 trailers were, quote, this management community. And then there were 500 Portuguese in the bunkhouse because at that time, Canadians wouldn't go up into what was called the bush, but the Portuguese would come over and work in the bush on these big power plant or powerhouse construction. So what Dad did is he opened, oh, I keep calling him Dad, but that just goes to show you. What George did while we were corresponding and everything is he went ahead and opened up a bank account in Vancouver, a joint bank account, because there wasn't any bank up there in the bush. And like the 500 Portuguese were sending their checks to Portugal. So anyhow, I got a Dear John letter that, you know, this relationship just isn't working because, you know, it's just letters, and I have this, I don't like living up here alone in this quote, bush. And George was from Haiti, so here he is, north of the tundra. I mean, there was only 6 weeks of summer, and all the rest was very cold winters and all of that. So I get this Dear John letter, and I also have a joint bank account, and I'm really upset. So this is probably October, and what I did is I went and I told my father that I was going to go and see this man that I had met in the summer. I just had to go and see him face to face because he said he wanted to break off this relationship. Now, wasn't that the dumbest thing in the whole world? I took the money, I bought a plane ticket in 1958, flew from Vancouver to Winnipeg. Then I got on a little tiny plane and flew from Winnipeg up to La Paz, which was where I caught the Hudson Bay Railway to go to mile 256. Then the construction site had this little spur, which was two cars. One of the cars was for cargo and one was for a few passengers, and it had a potbelly stove in there. And I show up on this campsite and I asked for George Lafontant. And he didn't even know I was coming. Can you believe this? So anyhow, what happened is he had me stay with this Scottish couple, married couple in their mobile home, and we talked about how he had broken off this relationship. And so he looked at me and he said, well, I think I'm going to marry you. So it wasn't even really a proposal. So he said, I can have some time off in December to come out and meet your family. And when he came out, he took me to a jewelry store, and Burke's was the best jewelry store in Vancouver. And he says, I've got $250. And so I went in the store and I said, show me rings that cost $250. I never asked for anything less. And that kind of surprised George because he had budgeted for up to that amount, and that's what I spent. And then he met my family, and everybody was fine about that. But my dad was really afraid because this was a total stranger that I was going to marry and leave home and go up to the wilderness of Canada. So my dad was very, very upset. And also my dad was really upset about me leaving my nurse's training before I completed it. And my dad went to the director of nurses and talked to her and said, now made a condition. And he came out and he was so proud and I was so upset. Dad said, the director of nurses says if you should ever become separated, divorced, or widowed, you will be accepted back into this school of nursing. And I was just furious because I was so optimistic, I was so in love, and I was going to marry this guy forever where nothing bad was ever going to happen. This is the 1950s, we were going to live happily ever after. And, but now, of course, or even a few years later, I could understand my father's concern that I had a high school education, but no real ability to take care of myself if anything happened to George or the marriage or whatever. So that's how we got engaged. But I was always a little bit upset with George to say, well, I guess I'll marry you, or I guess, it wasn't even, that was a very, very strange thing. But he calls it my one flash of brilliance in my whole life, that I hopped on that plane and I said, do you really mean you don't love me and that you don't want to? Oh gosh, what a crazy person.
So where were you married?
We were married in Vancouver, British Columbia at St. Augustine's Church, which was the same church, Catholic church, that I had been accepted in December at Christmas time. And that was a pretty interesting thing because from the time that George left to find work, the end of June, until December, I had private instructions. All I did is George had pointed out this Catholic church to me, so even though it wasn't close to the hospital, I went over there and I knocked at the door of the rectory and I just asked if there was somebody who could tell me about the Catholic Church. I didn't know what the Catholic Church was. And that's when I met Father Jim McGrath, and he gave me private instructions for 6 months, which was quite unusual. But I had such an unusual schedule. When we were student nurses, we were either in class or working on the floor, and so they'd do split shifts, sometimes it was really the dark ages of student nursing. We were pretty much slaves as far as, in order to get our training, today's interns probably are still doing the same thing, they're working those long shifts and long times and very little pay.
Describe your relationship with Father Jim.
Well, my relationship with Father Jim is very important because he took the time to give me private instructions. And then when we returned to Vancouver, he was still a priest at that parish 5 years after we were married. And he baptized Michael, who was born in Vancouver, our third child. And then he was transferred to Saskatchewan, I think, and Ontario and all of that. But once he baptized Michael, then we corresponded, and anytime he came back to Vancouver, he would come and visit us. And so he really adopted us as a family for us. He was really very important in our life because he was kind of a consistent thing, because my parents were divorced and it always became difficult. We had to visit my father, or our family had to visit with my mother, and it took years before they would all finally get together and visit with us all at the same time and be at the same place and things like that. So Father Jim was very, very important for consistency, somebody who was like the rock, you know, that really supported our family and our relationship, because he just took that on as a task, I guess. I don't know. We never lived in the same place, but we always kept close. So that was another important person in our life. Is it time now to?
Yeah, don't know what it was. Alrighty. So describe the ceremony for your wedding.
Okay. Because George was working up there in northern Manitoba and he was just going to take a few days off to come to get married, and then so he was traveling, and we got married on a Monday morning, which is very unusual. But we had a lot of friends, my family and friends. Nobody came from Haiti for our wedding, which, you know, that wasn't good. But we got married on a Monday morning at 10 o'clock at the same St. Augustine Church in Vancouver, followed by a reception at our home. And there was about 125 people, which was a lot to come back to our house, but at the same time not so unusual. The weather was fine. It was a nice sunny morning. It rained a little bit the morning, and my grandpa Hernsted said it's good luck to have a few sprinkles on a wedding day. And then George and I, we went to a motel, but we were starving hungry. So we actually stopped and had a hamburger before we went to the motel. And then we came back the next morning to our house to pack the wedding gifts, to arrange for that to be sent up to northern Manitoba. And so our honeymoon was pretty much the trip between, we flew from Vancouver to Winnipeg. We stayed at a nice hotel in Winnipeg. We went shopping for things that we needed that we didn't get as wedding gifts, or that what George knew that we would need to have when we got up to the mile 256 of the Hudson Bay Railway. And so pretty much that was our honeymoon, was the big trip to get back to northern Manitoba.
Do you have photos from up there or not?
Probably, but they might be slides.
Right. Oh, that's good.
Yeah. In fact, we got a whole slideshow of
Just take a minute to talk, describe about this place where you first lived when you were there.
Okay. When we were first married, our first home was on mile 256 of the Hudson Bay Railway. And then you had to take this little 2-car train into the big project site, which was going to be the construction of a powerhouse. There was one short block where there were 12 trailers. They were 10 feet by 50 feet. On one side of the road, and then I think there was 10 or 12 small little houses, prefabbed houses. The iron ore company was there, and Bechtel was in charge of construction. Then there was a bunkhouse with 500 Portuguese workers, and there were no grocery stores. So when I went to buy my groceries, I had to go to the back of the mess hall, and the butcher would get me my meat or my vegetables or whatever. I had to learn how to bake all of the bread. There was no bread. So even if we wanted a hot dog, I had to do hot dog buns. There were the other women that were up there were mostly from Manitoba, and they were farm wives, so they all knew how to bake their own bread. So they taught me how to bake bread. And because they were farm wives, very often they would have their bread all ready by like 7 o'clock in the morning. They'd already got their bread for the day, and George would come home for coffee at 10, and he would want to take some of that rising bread dough and flatten it all out and make kind of like a little tortilla or something, but then he would sprinkle it with, and fry it in a fry pan, and he'd sprinkle it with butter and sugar. I thought that was unusual, but I know that I baked bread at least 3 times a week because it didn't last so well. The trailer was fully furnished, of course, as all those mobile homes were. And I had a washer and dryer that were stacked up on top of each other. The women were very good. There were some French Canadian women there that didn't speak very much English, but basically the community was so small, less than 20 women, that we all helped one another with whatever, and played cards and had coffee, and it was quite an isolated place for all of us. But the only reason anybody was up there was that the salaries were very good, but they were building this power plant on a 24-hour schedule, so it was a pretty rough life as far as everybody was isolated. And I got pregnant with our first child almost immediately, and there was a small little hospital and a doctor on site, but he wouldn't deliver first babies. So that's why I had to take the train all the way back to La Paz, and then a 90-mile train ride up to Flin Flon. And I went out when I was about 4 months pregnant, and saw a doctor, and stayed with an old maid aunt of one of the women that was on the campsite. And I didn't see another doctor then until I went out 2 weeks before our first baby was born. Now, again, I was a very young, naive, or whatever, but I had, in my nurse's training, I had delivery room and nursery. So I had completed my obstetrics part of, and pediatrics. So I had actually completed all of this. So being in the delivery room gave me a lot more education than most 20-year-olds were, but it was also just naivety that everything was going to be okay. That's kind of, really, is that a positive attitude?
Well, let's talk about that then for a second. Because we don't have a lot of time to talk about the kids, but
no.
Let's just quickly talk about each birth.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, let's just talk about each birth. So did Dad come up with you then?
Okay, no. For our first baby, I had to travel alone. The Hudson Bay Railway only ran 3 times a week, and I traveled alone to Flin Flon and stayed with this maiden aunt. She was a school teacher. She was about 70 years old, and her name was May Goodwin. And I stayed with her 2 weeks before our first child, Monique, was born. And what happened was that we'd gone to tea at this even older lady's house. It was quite close to the hospital in Flin Flon. And my labor started, and these two ladies who were 70 and say 80 years old, they got quite stressed out. They were upset and everything else. And so I tried to remain very calm, and May and I walked over to the hospital, maybe only 3 or 4 city blocks. And the hospital, the obstetrics rooms were all full. So they put me at the end of a hall, and they put some of those it's a cloth divider on wheels to sort of give me some privacy. And because I'd been a student nurse, I knew everything that had to happen before, and I insisted that it did. And so from the beginning of my labor until my first child was born was 3 hours. And because I'd had delivery room experience, I didn't want them to give me any gas, which is what they did at the time, you know. And Monique weighed 8 pounds, and I sent a telegram to George that the baby had arrived, you know, 8 pounds, 20 inches, and she's a beautiful girl. So he took the next train, Hudson Bay Railway, to Flin Flon, and he came to, it was St. Anne's Hospital. And we had decided on the name before, and her name was Renee Monique. And the first time the nurse brought the baby to me, said, "Here's your little Reenie." And so I got all upset about that because people mispronounce my name, Andriene. There's no way they can say it if they see it written. And so I called her Monique. That was the end of that. So when George came to the hospital, the train didn't get in till 11 o'clock and at night, and it was the Grey Nuns that ran that hospital, but they were French from Quebec. And so Dad said, "I want to see my wife and baby." And they said, "Oh no, you can't do that." And he says, "I've traveled all these miles." And they let him in. And when he got to see his first baby, her face was so red and she had hardly any hair. And George says, "Wow, she's as red as a tomato, but her hair's growing in pretty fast." And he thought babies were all born bald and that their hair grew. So what little bit of hair she had. And the reason that we called Monique Monique was because at the time in 1959, when we were married on May 4th, that was St. Monica's or St. Monique's Day. And so that was the reason for the name Monique. And Renee is the name of George's mother. Her name was Renee. So that was the reason for the choice of the names. So of course, I know what happens. I know all the stages, so I'm going to be okay. What was I thinking? So that could, are you recording that a little bit? Okay, I'm going to talk about what happened, how come we moved before the second baby, because we're up there in northern Manitoba, and George just said, "Look, I've had this. We've got to get out of here. There's got to be a better life than living up in the wilderness." And so he started to apply for jobs, and he applied to San Francisco, to Bechtel, for a job. Well, here comes this application from northern Manitoba to San Francisco asking for a job. So Bechtel wrote to George back in response and said, "Well, we do have a job for you in Labrador City, Newfoundland." So we talked it over, and at the time George was working for Manitoba Hydro, which is a provincial company, so that meant his whole work life would be someplace in Manitoba. And neither one of us wanted to live our life in Manitoba, so we accepted the job with Bechtel, which was a global company even at that time, up to Labrador of all places, thinking, well, that means we're not going to always be in Labrador. Bechtel can move us here, there, wherever. Bechtel hired us because anybody who's crazy enough to be living up in the bush there can go to another bush. So when we flew into Labrador City, there was not such a thing as Labrador City. It was going to be an iron ore pelletizing plant, and I had this 6-month-old baby, And the cargo was strapped in the middle of the plane, and there were benches on side by side, and they felt sorry for me, so they took me off the bench and put me up with the pilot, and I could see only trees and water over Labrador. And I thought, holy smokes. And when we landed on a gravel strip, I was so happy. I thought, I'm never going to leave this place until the job is over. Like, I'm not going to do this again. And so anyhow, what happened is that we did get pregnant with the second baby. And when the 9 months was up, I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I knew that the baby had died. I just knew the baby had died. So I waited until 6, which was the normal time for Dad to wake up, George to wake up, and I told him, and we took the baby, our Monique, and over to the doctor. There was a doctor in a hospital there in Labrador City, because it was a pretty big project and it was going to be a permanent community. And the doctor couldn't hear a heartbeat. And so we did have good friends there, and they kept Monique, and they flew me out with Dad to Montreal and induced the labor. And so this little boy was a stillborn. I mean, he never breathed or whatever. And the only problem with that birth was that they thought it was bad to show the parents their dead baby. I mean, if you'd had a live birth and the baby died, you would have known it. But they thought that was too traumatic. And of course, that was totally wrong. And then the only other thing that happened was that George came into the room and said, I've named the boy John because there's nobody in our family called John. And I thought that was a really beautiful name. And because the Catholic calendar and everything has been so important to me, I did look up August 29 to see what day it was, and it was the feast of the beheading of St. John the Baptist. If you can believe. I mean, that was like, ooh, one of those things, because here we had named our daughter Monique after the feast day of the day we got married. And so this was the first bad thing that had ever happened in my life personally, that like I was totally out of my control. I had had a healthy, wonderful, safe first delivery, and so, I mean, how did this bad thing happen? I mean, you know. So the only problem, again, was I felt so bad. They kept me for 10 days before we went back, returned, and that was a big separation, to be separated from our baby Monique. But I was still very, very sad about losing this baby. And so my response to losing the baby was, please God, give me all the babies you want to give me. You know, I really did. I had that emptiness that I really wanted a baby. So I got pregnant pretty sooner than maybe I should have. But Monique was almost 3 before our third child, but you know, that our son David was born. And his name is George David, because when he was born, he looked exactly like my husband George. It was like, oh my goodness, here's a little George. And so that's the reason. And also, in hindsight, George's father's name is George. And so he was George the Third, I guess, if in a way he was. But He was the 9th baby born in Labrador City, and there was a church there then, so he was baptized in Labrador City. But George, my husband, said, living in the bush is just crazy. We've just got to get out of here. And that's when we left, and I went to Vancouver and stayed with my mother and her husband Roy while George looked for work, first in Chicago, because that's where one of his bosses were. And when he came out to Vancouver, he was looking through the professional engineers in British Columbia, and he saw a name of somebody who he had worked with in Manitoba. And he went ahead and went and saw this fellow, and he got a job in a design office rather than working in construction. So we were able to live in Vancouver, British Columbia. My father had returned to Alberta with my brother Paul. My sister Bev and her husband Jim had just been accepted at veterinarian college in Ontario. So the house at 5630 was available, the house that I'd grown up in, available for George and myself, Monique and David. And shortly after that, I was pregnant with our son Michael, who was born in Vancouver, British Columbia. And then Dad got a letter that said, or a phone call from a boss from a job in Chicoutimi, Quebec, of all places. And Vic Hughes is calling and saying, George, I've just started working for this wonderful company called Caterpillar Tractor, and I'd like to arrange for an interview for you to come to Peoria, Illinois. And I said, well, no, because I was living at home. We had 3 babies. I was a very nationalistic generation of Canadians. I mean, what did we need America for? And George had had his university education in the States and felt like it was a better opportunity for the children and our family. So he took me along in May of 1966 to Peoria, and we left the children with my mother and went for the interview to Peoria, Illinois. And at that time they had to just make a search that nobody in the state of Illinois could do the job they wanted to hire George for. And so in, I guess maybe September, they wrote a letter and said, we would like you to come if you're still interested. And so that's when we drove from the 2,400 miles from Vancouver to Peoria.
When was Michael born?
Michael was born in 1964. And
so before you went on this trip to Peoria?
Oh, I'm sorry. Michael was born in 1964, and then in 1966, George got a phone call.
So just touch on Mike's birth then.
Michael.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Michael's was very interesting because we had a laundry room outside of the kitchen, and Dad had been out. It was poker night or something, and he came home, and he says, what are you doing up? And I says, oh, well, I'm going to have this baby tonight. And we had just bought a brand new car. And before I knew it, for Michael, the waters had broke, and we had these 2 babies. You know, Monique was 4 and David was 18 months, and we had to put them in the back seat of the car and drive to the hospital. And George kept saying to me, don't have this baby in this brand new car, you know. And I wasn't in the hospital an hour before Michael was born. That was just unbelievable. But I'm trying to think about, that was in Vancouver. He was born in Vancouver. And so then back will this be backtracking
Yeah,
then?
that's fine.
How we got
No,
to
it's fine.
Peoria, Illinois he was born in April of 1964, and then we went on in the fall of 1966, we went to Peoria, Illinois, and I really wanted another baby. And George, he was just, 3, that's a lot of responsibility, and I've just started out work with this new company, but because you've given up your country and followed me, no, he knew that I had really made a big sacrifice to say, okay, you think this is the most important thing for our family is to come to United States, and so yes, we can have one more baby. And that's when I got pregnant with our 4th child, Mark. And I remember I was only about 3 or 4 weeks pregnant, and I told the neighbor, I'm going to have a baby boy, and his name is Mark Joseph. And she looked at me like, what? How could you say that? And it was really true. And George's mother came, she had broken her hip and was having trouble with the physical therapy and everything, and so she came to stay with us in Peoria. So while I was pregnant with Mark, I had my 70-year-old mother-in-law with a broken hip. And I had 3 babies, and I had to take her to physical therapy 3 times a week and everything. And she didn't speak any English. And so the night that my labor started with Mark, we actually left her with the babies, but she'd already been living with us for 6 months. And again, Dad wasn't allowed in the delivery room, but this is the first one. Oh, I'm going to backtrack. George had to take the 2 babies, had phoned to my mother, who lived quite a ways away, and had taken the 2 babies to my mother's. And so when he got back to the hospital, Michael was already born. So he had never been there for a new baby. But because I had Mark then in Peoria at St. Francis Hospital, and because I'd had him without any medicines or anything, they had put Mark on my tummy, or on me, wrapped up, of course, on the stretcher, and wheeled me out of the delivery room. And that's the first time that George had seen Mark. And he still had that white kind of waxy on him a little bit. And I'm saying, oh, isn't he beautiful? Oh, isn't this the most beautiful baby you've ever seen? And George is going like, yuck, yuck, because he had never, the baby hadn't had any kind of his first bath or anything like that. And he couldn't see how beautiful that Mark was. He had come out of the father's waiting room, and here I am. And I was so hyper, and I believe Mark was born about 6 o'clock in the morning, and by 7 o'clock I'm calling all of the neighbors in Peoria, everybody who I thought really cared a lot that I had this beautiful baby boy. I just had to share it with everybody.
Okay.
The end.